At the Pacific School of Religion, where I attended seminary, we were required to take a foundational course that is structured around exploring our personal theology. It was easily one of the most important classes I took. Not so much for the specific reading that was required or academic engagement, which all was excellent. Rather, it was important because it set me up to approach ministry as a posture in the world that's built around reflecting on spiritual concerns. It's one thing to understand how to run a church organization, and another thing to know how to put together the resources to make that organization sustainable. It is another thing altogether, and a unique aspect of anything that we call ministry, where it relates to the Spirit, to carry with it an intentionally reflective and exploratory character. Asking me to be able to write and speak about my personal theology was both daunting and liberating. It is a huge task if you've never done it before. It also felt like I had suddenly been given permission to express all of my deepest feelings about spiritual life. I regard reflection on my personal theology as an ongoing part of my spiritual practice, and it will likely be with me the rest of my life. Now, I know that for some people the word theology doesn't mean a lot. Or worse, it means too much. Many people hear it and immediately think dogma and creed and specific religious texts and what amounts to all of the rules of religion. But the thing I was taught was to receive the word theology with a light touch, and a sense of the limitations we have in the English language to express spiritual concerns. The origins of the word, from the Greek theo, meaning God, Lord, Creator, etc., and logos, meaning word, reason, logic, etc., are only a beginning toward understanding what it means to have a language to translate something that is deeply personal and that can also be very, very public in ways. Basically, what I learned was to understand the word theology as meaning how we interact with our inner life, and how that inner life guides us to interact with the outside world, and then how we can receive the outside world through the filter of our inner life. Understanding theology this way lets me have some flexibility with my own ideas about God, and also lets me receive others who have very different belief systems to mine. For me, this fits perfectly with Unitarian Universalism. Take the fourth principle, for example, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Through my understanding of theology, a statement like this is not a license for bigotry, nor is it permission to abuse the concept of freedom of speech. Instead, it's an invitation to the shared experience of different truths and different meanings as part of a shared human family. Last weekend was a beautiful example of some of the best of what I believe sits at the heart of progressive faith. The community of the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Boston received us in an open embrace, clearly sharing their Christian identity, but welcoming our diverse theological spiritual community. In opening the service, the Very Reverend Amy McCreath mentioned how through these times we are living in, we are gathering from many different places, but that we're also able to be together spiritually, and that helps us to carry so much in our hearts and minds. She specifically reminded us that St. Paul's is a Christian worship service, but that the cathedral is where all are welcome. Inspired by words from the book of Isaiah, the cathedral is a house of prayer for all people. In particular, I love how she invited people to participate as fully as they feel called to do, and named that any time one would see a name for God or pronouns that don't align with your personal take on spirit, to use whatever language is your prayer, or that accords with your experience of the sacred. They laid out a table, and we partook deeply. I was first of all impressed with how many from our community showed up. It actually made me pretty emotional. But then you stayed, and you stayed engaged in conversation. You all did the thing that I've been so hungry to see this community do. You demonstrated how to be welcomed. You were gracious and generous guests, and I thank you. It was this way of showing up that prompted the title for my message this week, Me-ology and We-ology. How is generosity part of your personal spirituality? I'm convinced that in addition to a theologos, a spiritual framework that holds our sense of the divine or deeply spiritual or God, we also need a way to understand how this concept of inner life reveals the self and how it connects to others. It is important that we identify whatever is our ultimate concern, thank you, Paul Tillich, and then also identify how that ultimate concern is an expression of self and an expression of our connectedness to life. We need, quite simply, a me-ology and a we-ology. What I saw in First Parish in Cambridge last Sunday, and this is not any kind of a slam against anyone who couldn't make it or wasn't interested, because what I'm talking about is a growing spirit that I've seen through the whole community. What I saw in First Parish was a willingness to bring yourselves, a willingness to share what you bring, and a willingness to bring and share without judgment of yourselves or those you are connecting with. This is a generosity of spirit that I'm convinced has the power to change this world. And boy, oh boy, we are a world deeply in need of change. The violence in Atlanta this week against Asian Americans let us know that there are more places for us to show up, to share of ourselves, and to do so without judgment. The embrace of community can heal. It's fine for us to show up with a principle-free and responsible search for truth and meaning, but it is transformative for us to show up with a way to put this principle into action. This is most important in anything we do in the area of anti-racism, where so often, so many of us are searching for the right way to show up. Honestly, it comes back to this place of generosity, willingness to bring yourself, to share of your authentic self and your non-judgmental self. You may not know directly the pain being experienced by people in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities right now, and you may have little experience of their experience. But this is where you show up like you did at St. Paul's, not as the armchair expert on AAPI history and oppression, but as the compassionate human who abhors acts of violence that single out others based on their identities and who they are. As a black man in these United States, I have received exactly that same compassion and humility from folks, specifically AAPI, South Asian, Native and Indigenous, and Latinx. This is how people of color show up for each other. One of the best examples of this I saw came from a surprising source. Comedian Amber Ruffin offered a brief analysis of the tragedy on her show. She spoke more as a journalist than a comedy writer, and by the end she was visibly moved by what she was sharing. She was no longer Amber Ruffin, rising comedy star, but Amber, black woman in solidarity. But this is something people of color in progressive faith, in particular, have a great deal of practice doing. We bring generosity as part of our spiritual selves, because we have experienced the gift of that generosity so often in return. It is the balm in Gilead. It is the greatest practice that all of us can follow. I'm offering this message today as part of our ongoing narrative through the month of March, as a reflection on both our Soul Matters theme, commitment, and connected to our efforts to remind the congregation about the importance of giving as part of how we are in community. For all the talk of language and history, my message today is simple. Generosity is a spiritual posture in the world. Generosity asks us to bring ourselves, to share of ourselves, and to do this without judging either ourselves or those around us. It is the same with how we look at our generosity to First Parish in Cambridge. Certainly, we want you to be generous financially, in a way that makes sense for your personal financial situation, of course. We also want you to find generosity in how you give your time to the community. Generosity is also what I believe must drive how we stay connected to each other, particularly through this time, providing companionship and community to each other. Generosity is also part of our creative drive that lets us offer our creative selves, music, readings, art, innovation as a demonstration of all that we are. And all of these generosities are supported by the generosity of spirit that says this community is a place where you can bring your personal theology, share it with others, and know that it will not be judged. This generosity of spirit, the willingness and the humility to give and receive, is what turns theology into a precious me-ology, and then allows us all to celebrate in a we-ology, where we all can thrive. Blessed be, and may it be so.